It seemed like a match made in heaven. But a troubled marriage pushed her to the edge.
I went crazy. I was like this, and you see pictures of me like this.
And it ended in murder.
They moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah!
There's some element of perhaps even evil in her that makes her dangerous.
November 5th, 1989. As the sun rose over the San Diego enclave of Marston Hills, the quiet of a Sunday morning was suddenly shattered by the sound of gunfire. It came from the home of one of the city's most prominent attorneys, Daniel Broderick III. When San Diego police arrived at the house, they found no evidence of a break-in, but in the bedroom, a grisly scene. The 44-year-old lawyer lay on the floor, a bullet through his back. His wife, 28-year-old Linda Kolkena Broderick, was stretched across the bed, the sheets drenched in blood from shots to her head and chest. Police quickly announced an all-out search for their sole suspect in the double murder.
We have an all-units broadcast for Elizabeth Ann Broderick, who is the former wife of Daniel Broderick, one of the victims here. We believe she has some information regarding this case.
Later that day, Elizabeth Ann Broderick, known as Betty, turned herself in. The 41-year-old mother of four would be tried on 2 counts of first-degree murder. There was no doubt that she had pulled the trigger. The question that would haunt her case was why? On November 10th, more than 600 of the city's elite gathered to mourn the deaths of Dan and Linda Broderick. The shooting became the talk of San Diego. At society parties, men joked that it was Be Nice to the Ex-Wife week. But friends of the couple believed that Betty's murderous rage had been brewing for years.
I knew immediately that she had done it. I was not completely surprised. Shocked, yes, that it actually happened. Totally surprised? No, I wasn't.
At first, it had seemed like a storybook romance. Betty Bisceglia was a college freshman in 1965 when she met her future husband. At a party following a Notre Dame football game, a bookish, skinny senior introduced himself by writing his name on a napkin, Daniel T. Broderick, MDA. MDA, he told Betty, stood for Medical Doctor Almost. He had just been accepted to Cornell Medical School in New York City.
She was a model. She was very bright, very successful. And Dan, as the story was told by many people, when he first met her, he determined that that was going to be his wife.
Dan and Betty were married 4 years later, in April 1969. At the wedding, they vowed to stay together for at least 50 years. 9 months after their honeymoon, Betty gave birth to their first child. They would eventually have 4, 2 girls and 2 boys. While Dan worked his way first through medical school, then Harvard Law, Betty took care of the homemaking, as well as much of the breadwinning for the growing family.
When you go into a marriage, it really is a contract. She felt this was something they were doing for both of them, and this was her half of the contract.
In 1973, her investment seemed to pay off when Dan accepted a job at the prestigious San Diego law firm Gray Carey.
Dan was a success because Dan was extremely bright, hardworking. He had a keen insight into people. People liked him.
5 years later, at Betty's urging, he left the firm and went solo. Soon, he was pocketing huge fees from the medical malpractice suits that had become his specialty. Calling himself Count de Money, Dan got a nose job and filled his closet with hand-tailored suits. The seemingly charmed couple became fixtures on the San Diego social circuit. Dan's success finally allowed Betty to stop working outside the home. She could now focus full-time on what she loved most, being a wife and mother.
She was well known within the community of being a supermom. The parents loved her, the neighborhood's kid loved her, all the children loved her.
She appeared to have the perfect life. A home in the Tony suburb of La Jolla, a membership at an exclusive country club, and an unlimited shopping budget. But Dan and Betty's conspicuous consumption disguised the tensions that had been building between them from the beginning.
I don't believe that there was ever a time that either one of them thought that their marriage was a marriage made in heaven.
A virgin at the altar, Betty would later claim that Dan had virtually raped her on their wedding night. Over the next 10 years, she would endure the death of one child shortly after birth, as well as 2 miscarriages. While Betty worked various jobs to help keep the family afloat, Dan spent long nights out drinking with his colleagues. He considered it networking, a necessary step in the climb up the legal ladder. But the more successful he became, the more their marriage grew strained.
They seemed somewhat distant from each other. I did not detect any real warmth in their relationship.
Behind closed doors, they often argued, sometimes violently. Betty once threw a bottle of ketchup at Dan. Another time, he angrily hurled an empty aquarium off the 2nd floor balcony. Though Betty often brought up divorce, she knew it was an empty threat. More and more, she depended on her husband for money, friends, and increasingly, her very identity. By the early 1980s, Dan and Betty Broderick had built the California life of their dreams, and it was slowly becoming a nightmare. Even as their relationship was falling apart, Dan and Betty Broderick clung to their marriage. Both were from traditional Catholic families and viewed their wedding vows as unbreakable. But in 1983, when Dan hired a beautiful 22-year-old as his personal assistant, Betty began to suspect that her husband was cheating on her. The affair that was finally exposed would drive Dan to divorce and Betty to murder. On the afternoon of November 22nd, 1983, Betty Broderick arrived at her husband Dan's San Diego law office, armed with a bottle of champagne and a dozen red roses. It was his 39th birthday, and Betty hoped her romantic surprise would help salvage a marriage on the verge of collapsing. What she found instead confirmed a wife's worst fears. Birthday decorations littered the room. On the desk sat an empty bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and the remnants of a chocolate cake. An office secretary told Betty that her husband had left around lunchtime with his 22-year-old assistant, Linda Kolkena. Devastated, Betty sat in the office and waited for Dan to return. He never did. When she finally drove home, her rage boiled over.
She took his clothes and set them all on fire. It was just something to express how she felt, because now finally the truth came home.
Dan had hired Linda Kolkena as his personal assistant a few months before.
I started seeing the 2 of them together after work, perhaps for a drink or at a social event, and it wasn't like anything obvious or sneaking around or anything like that at all. It was just something that evolved.
Betty was immediately suspicious of this striking young blonde. She told her husband, "Get rid of the little or get out." But Dan denied that they were having an affair. He called Betty crazy and told her she was imagining things. Even after the disaster on his 39th birthday, Dan continued to insist there was nothing between him and Linda. All the while, he was growing more and more disdainful of his wife. According to Betty, He often called her old, fat, boring, ugly, and stupid. It was all part of a deliberate, methodical campaign, she would later contend, to drive her insane.
The thing that you have to realize is Dan made his money by showing the psychological effects of trauma on his clients. He was a doctor. He was trained on how these types of things will psychologically destroy people.
Torn between fury and fear, her behavior increasingly erratic, Betty tried desperately to hold on to her husband. But when Dan moved out of the house in February 1985, leaving Betty behind with their 4 children, she came unglued. Thinking he would find new respect for her, after a few weeks of full-time fatherhood, Betty dumped the kids crying on Dan's doorstep. It was a mistake she would forever regret.
Dan just hired babysitters, but now he realized he had an advantage. He had the children. And so when she realized that wasn't going to work and wanted the children back, he wasn't going to give the children back to her.
On September 23rd, after 16 years of marriage, Dan Broderick filed for divorce. A month later, he finally told his wife she'd been right all along. He had been having an affair with Linda Kolkena, and they had fallen in love. Soon after that, he informed her that he had sold the family home. In a rage, Betty rushed to the mansion Dan had recently bought in the San Diego neighborhood of Marston Hills. When he refused to speak to her, she carefully lined up her Chevy Suburban and rammed it into the front door. After a violent scuffle, Dan called the police, who led Betty away in a straitjacket. She would spend the next 3 days in a mental institution. Friends of Dan and Linda tried to warn them that Betty was dangerously unstable.
I didn't know if Betty's problem could be dealt with, so I would discuss with Dan and Linda their moving away. And that's when Dan told me that if Betty really wanted to kill him, she would kill him wherever he was.
Having sacrificed so much to see her husband succeed, Betty felt discarded, replaced by a younger version of herself. She lashed out at the couple, referring to Linda as the whore, and leaving angry and obscene messages on their new answering machine.
This is a message to Ed and the You have one hell of a nerve dumping the kids here on the sidewalk and zooming away without making any attempt to communicate with me about my plans for the weekend.
A few minutes later came another.
Ed, come get the kids. I want to get rid of them, but I don't like driving to your neighborhood. Hurry up and come get them. Asshole.
In July 1986, Dan was granted a divorce and given sole custody of their 4 children. He would voluntarily provide Betty with financial support until the final settlement could be worked out. In a formal letter, he let her know that if the phone messages didn't stop, the money would. From now on, he wrote, when you leave a message or call and use any vulgar or obscene language, you will be fined $100 per offensive word. These fines will be withheld from your support checks. Other fines were later added for trespassing and unannounced visits. 1 month that fall, Betty ended up $1,300 in debt after her violations were deducted.
Dan's personality was such that when he didn't react very well to people who were hysterical, and so I think the more that she acted outrageously, the more he pulled back, which only made her act even more outrageous.
The Brodericks' divorce became one of the most bizarre in California history. Settlement negotiations dragged on for over 2 years. Finally, in December 1988, the 2 parties came before a judge. Betty represented herself, claiming that she hadn't been able to find a qualified attorney willing to take on her powerful husband, who had recently served as president of the San Diego Bar Association.
That's absolutely nonsense. There are divorce lawyers in this town, and there were at that time, who did not even know Dan Broderick. They could have cared less as long as they're being compensated.
That January, the trial judge announced that Betty would receive $16,000 a month until she remarried, and custody of one of their 4 children, 17-year-old daughter, Lee. Betty was livid, insisting she deserved a much better settlement.
You say, what were the complaints here? And the divorce to her was more than just money. But let's just get to the money part. He was taking home $140,000 a month. And she worked hard for all that. She sacrificed. She just got totally cremated.
Several weeks later, Betty bought a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. On April 22, 1989, 10 days after what would have been Betty and Dan's 20th anniversary, Linda Kolkena became the second Mrs. Dan Broderick. Having lost her husband and 3 of her children, Betty sank deeper into despair. A friend of hers, Diane Black, recalls Betty's state of mind at the time. Due to the notoriety of the case, she agreed to be interviewed by American Justice only in silhouette.
She was extremely depressed. She would become reclusive. I would call her and she wouldn't call me back. And then when I would see her later, she would say, yeah, that was a really rough week for me. And so that's how, lots of times that's how I know she was depressed.
Betty wept frequently, complained bitterly, and had put on 60 pounds. And in the small hours of the morning on November 5th, 2 days before her 42nd birthday, she finally broke. That night, as she had so many nights before, Betty found herself too upset to sleep. Getting out of bed, she picked up a letter that had arrived a few days earlier from Dan's attorney. The letter was a warning, threatening her with a contempt of court citation for the messages she continued to leave on her ex-husband's answering machine. I can't take this anymore, Betty wrote on the bottom of a document from Dan's attorney. Them constantly insinuating I'm crazy. In a mounting frenzy, barely able to stand up, she drove to Dan and Linda's house. Her gun was in her purse. It was just before dawn. With her daughter's keys, she opened the back door. Silently, she crept through the kitchen, up the stairs, and into the master bedroom. Her ex-husband and his new wife lay asleep in their bed. She raised the gun and fired 5 times. Was it cold-blooded murder? Or was she driven to kill? That's the issue a San Diego jury would have to untangle in a trial that paraded the sordid spectacle of Dan and Betty Broderick's marriage before a fascinated public. That's next. Opening arguments in the trial of Betty Broderick began on October 22, 1990. Nearly a year after she had shot and killed her ex-husband Dan and his new wife, Linda. Spectators lined up in advance to get seats in the small gallery. A courtroom camera brought the proceedings into San Diego homes. TV stations would even preempt soap operas to air Betty's testimony live. Betty Broderick had spent the months leading up to her trial at the Las Colinas Women's Detention Facility.
She was really frenetic. She was really animated. She talked about Dan in the present tense the whole time. She talked like he was still alive. She wasn't even dealing with the reality that what had happened.
Yet the accused killer had enough presence of mind to devote much of her time trying to shape the public's perception of her case. She answered letters from all over the country. She wrote her children frequently, and she placed collect calls to reporters all over Southern California.
She was very good at manipulating the press and telling this very broad-brushed story about all of the alleged abuse that she had suffered. The problem was that once you start looking at her story and once you start looking at the details of what she had to say about how she was treated by the victims, by the system, the vast majority of it was just a lie.
California versus Elizabeth Ann Broderick began with prosecutor Carrie Wells describing the defendant as a cold, calculated killer.
Dan and Linda Broderick, as I mentioned, were sound asleep in bed. Elizabeth Broderick stood in their bedroom at the side of their bed. She then took the .38 caliber revolver, pointed it at their sleeping bodies, and unloaded it into them.
As she often would during the trial, Wells turned Betty's own words against her, playing tapes of the angry messages she had so often left on her husband's answering machine, messages Dan Broderick had carefully recorded and transcribed.
I have very important things to ask you. You're making me mad. I'll kill you.
In his opening statement, defense attorney Jack Early painted a much different picture of Betty Broderick. Conceding that his client had pulled the trigger, he told the jury that she too was a victim, destroyed by her husband's infidelity. To demonstrate how Dan had slowly stripped Betty of her identity, the attorney set up a poster with photos showing the many facets of Betty's life, and one by one dramatically tore them down. The double murder, he contended, had been a spontaneous eruption, not a premeditated act.
Elizabeth Broderick fires the gun when they move. She has no intention of going there and firing the gun, and their only thought was to kill herself if Dan Broderick refused to deal with her.
The defendant, Early argued, had been driven to kill. The prosecution's star witness was 20-year-old Kim Broderick, the oldest daughter of Dan and Betty. Collapsing into tears several times during her 2 days on the stand, Kim detailed her mother's outrageous and often violent behavior. In the hours after the murder, she testified, her mother had shown no remorse.
I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, I'm not quite sure, but I don't think they're dead because your father was talking and everything's going to be all right. Just come home, calm down. You know I had to do it. I had no other choice. I couldn't let him win. One of us had to die."
Did she ever say that she was sorry about what had happened?
No.
Did she ever say that it was an accident and she didn't mean to do it?
No.
Kim told her mother she was sorry, and when her mother responded, the young woman burst into tears. Though her parents' marriage was not a happy one, Kim told the jury that her father was not to blame, and disputed the defense's description of him as an insensitive parent and an alcoholic.
Her mother was trying to make him out to be such a horrible monster, and so Kim was able to testify that, you know, he wasn't a monster. She was a very honest young woman in a very, very difficult situation, and I thought her testimony was valuable.
The prosecution drove home its case by playing a recording of a wrenching 30-minute phone conversation between Betty and her son Danny, at the time just 11 years old.
You both are separated, Mom. And he likes somebody else now. He doesn't like you anymore. And I mean, if you gotta stop saying the bad words. Why doesn't he like me anymore? Because he's sick of you. Because you guys get in all these fights. Why do we get in fights? I don't know. Because he was secretary. Even before that, you got in fights, Mom. I don't think so, Danny. See, you didn't know he was secretary for the last 2 years we were married. We want to live with you, but you're just making it harder for all of us that wants to live over there. If you stop saying bad words, everybody will be happier. At least I know I will.
The most powerful weapon for the defense was the defendant herself, a raw, emotional Betty Broderick. Occasionally sobbing, she traced her downward spiral, starting with the day she first met Dan Broderick. In riveting testimony, she explained how she reacted as Dan grew more and more critical of her and dissatisfied with their marriage.
A lot of this was my fault because I was old and fat and ugly and boring and stupid. And, you know, he just wasn't having any fun in life anymore. If you're old, fat, ugly, boring, and stupid, you try to be younger. And you go and try to get wrinkles taken off your face that weren't even there. You try and get your teeth fixed. I tried to be perfect. Absolutely flawlessly perfect for Dan Broderick.
Nothing seemed to work, she told the jury. She began to suspect that Dan was having an affair with Linda Kolkena, his young assistant. On Betty's 36th birthday in 1983, she became desperate.
When the kids went to bed, I slit my wrists and swallowed every pill I could find in the house. When Dan found me the next morning with all the blood in the bed and everything, he started crying. And he said that he wished I hadn't done that what would the kids do without me, and that there was nothing going on with Linda. And how many times can he tell me that there's nothing going on with Linda? And so I wanted to believe him.
Later, when the prosecution questioned the credibility of her suicide story, Betty walked off the witness stand and showed her scars to each of the jurors.
Betty was who Betty was. So she's not the kind of witness who you can control and prepare. I knew that we would lose some jurors, but I knew that there would be other jurors who would know you're seeing the truth. You're seeing exactly what went on, and I think all of the emotion and the crying and bringing that all up was just what she was going through at the time.
The defense attorney wanted the jury to understand exactly how his client had suffered at the hands of Dan Broderick. He led her through the details of the divorce, how Dan had terrorized her in court, how his prominence had left her powerless. Finally, they reached the morning of November 5th, 1989. Betty described her state of mind as she scrawled what she said was a suicide note.
I just couldn't stand it another minute. And that's what I wrote on the stuff, is I just can't stand this.
Her mind was a blur, she said, as she drove toward Dan's house. She claimed she brought the gun to get his attention.
What were you going to do when you got over there?
Just talk to him like I have done before, and just tell him that if you don't cut this out, I'm just going to kill myself. And I wanted to kill myself right in front of him and just splash my brains all over his damn house.
What happened when you went into the door?
It looked like Linda moved, and she went toward Dan, and Dan went toward the phone. They moved, and I moved, and it was over.
What's the first thing you remember? Do you remember pulling the trigger?
No, I remember the noise of the gun.
And how many times do you remember the gun going off?
I remember the real loud noise 5 times.
Prosecutor Carrie Wells cross-examined the defendant for several days, playing so many of her obscene phone messages that reporters started calling them the best of Betty. Wells tried to show that Broderick was never the victim, that she was lying about her passive role in the demise of the marriage. Betty's response was often that she simply didn't know the answer to the prosecution's questions.
I honestly don't remember things. I was a crazy person. He was telling people I was crazy. I went crazy. I was like this, and you see pictures of me like this, like I'm some kind of an electrified, crazy person.
To bolster his case, defense attorney Jack Early called neighbors and school teachers to the stand to describe how exceptional a parent Betty had been. And he brought in experts to discuss the psychological effects of adultery and abuse.
This case had been portrayed as a socialite who had lost her money. It's a standard ploy is that a woman scorned or a woman losing her money is going to be a woman full of wrath. I thought it was very degrading as to how important a woman's role in society is, especially when they give up their life for family, their professional life and other stuff. And so it was important for us to dispel that.
On November 15th, after 3.5 weeks of testimony, the case went to the 6-man, 6-woman jury. It was up to them to decide. Were the murders of Dan and Linda Broderick a double execution, as the prosecution had argued, or an act of emotion, as the defense had claimed? By the 4th day of deliberation, they still hadn't reached a verdict. 10 jurors wanted to convict Betty Broderick of murder, but 2 were holding out for a lesser charge, manslaughter. One later said of the shooting, "What took her so long?" Finally, the jury sent word to Judge Thomas Whalen that it was hopelessly deadlocked.
This time, ladies and gentlemen, I'll declare a mistrial in this case. Obviously, it's a shame we can't have a final resolution, but that's the way these things sometimes end up.
The state would be forced to try the case again.
The mistrial led many to question Prosecutor Carrie Wells' handling of the case. Believing that Betty Broderick's direct testimony had already established her guilt, Wells chose not to cross-examine her about the killings themselves. It was a mistake she wouldn't make again. Round 2 of California versus Elizabeth Ann Broderick is next.
In September 1991, just weeks before the start of her second murder trial, Betty Broderick again found herself in the news. A videotape had been leaked to the media of the kicking and screaming prisoner being dragged by deputies to an isolation cell.
Oh, Peraza, you liar! You're the one who made this whole thing up! Nothing ever happened!
After the cameras stopped rolling, jailhouse sources said, Betty defecated and smeared her feces all over the walls. Betty's attorney claimed the incident was a setup, an attempt by prison officials to manufacture evidence for the prosecution's case against Broderick.
They got a subpoena from the DA for any videotapes of Betty acting out in the jail. Lo and behold, there's a videotape of Betty acting out in the jail. Never had acted out before then. They'd never videotaped her before then.
Opening arguments in round 2 of Betty's case began on October 15th, nearly 1 year after the first round ended in a mistrial. The cameras of Court TV ensured that the second trial would be a national spectacle. The Broderick case was one of the first ever broadcast live by the fledgling network. Once again, the defense sought to portray Dan as the guilty party.
So what Dan did is when he took this and said, glass is not going to protect this picture. Your family is not going to be protected. And he smashed that family apart.
For the prosecutors, the experience of the first trial became a weapon in the second. They now knew what to expect from the defense and the defendant.
The second time around, we did know what people were going to actually say, and we knew definitely what Elizabeth Broderick was going to say. I had like 3 notebooks just filled with documents of things that rebutted her testimony. And so I was better able to be prepared with those things to cross-examine her.
In her testimony, Betty added new information about the morning of the murders as she described the frantic sequence of events. Pulling the trigger, ripping the phone from the wall, and fleeing her ex-husband's house. The defense hoped to convince the jury that Betty was out of control at the time of the killings, unaware of her actions or their consequences.
The movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved, and somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. Just, I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
But in a damaging cross-examination, Prosecutor Carrie Wells used transcripts from the first trial to confront Betty about her new version of the story.
Mrs. Broderick, there doesn't say anything there about Linda saying call the police, does it? No, it doesn't say that right there.
Wells continued her relentless questioning, badgering Betty about the minutiae of her marriage, including details of its violent fights, such as the time Betty got so mad that she threw a ketchup bottle at Dan.
The fact that the ketchup splattered all over the wall.
That's not true. No. I wish Dan was here to tell you the truth.
So do I.
So do I.
I think in the first trial, I was concerned about how aggressive I should be with Elizabeth Broderick. In the second trial, to be very honest, I had just pretty much had it with Elizabeth Broderick and her lies and just the horror that she'd inflicted on so many people for so long.
By challenging Betty's credibility as a witness, the prosecution hoped to cast doubt on her claim that the 5 shots had been fired in a dizzying panic, not a calculated fury. To support their case, prosecutors brought in a ballistics expert who testified that Betty's aim was too good to be accidental. In fact, they noted Betty had been a marksman during her school years. Prosecutors also effectively attacked the relevance of crucial elements of the defense's argument. One defense witness, an expert on battered women, had the scope of his testimony narrowed so much that he refused to take the stand. And when Betty's attorney tried to call witnesses who claimed to have heard Dan discuss hiring a hitman, the prosecution exploded.
Mr. Broderick solicited the murder of...
That's
Mr. Early,
not correct.
It's not correct, Mr. Early. You're doing that for your posturing for the benefit of the press that's in the courtroom. Knock it off.
I am not, Your Honor. We're talking about...
That's not fair, Judge. Come on. Do something about this.
Mr. Early, clear the courtroom.
The defense had hoped to use these witnesses to show that Betty's growing paranoia had been justified, that her husband was planning to kill her. But the judge ruled that because Betty was unaware of any murder plot, the evidence was irrelevant to her state of mind, and therefore inadmissible.
What really became the change in these cases is district attorneys started doing motions to exclude our evidence, and was successful. So the district attorney pretty much got to put on their whole case and more, and our case got cut by about 40%.
In her closing argument, prosecutor Carrie Wells told the jury that Betty Broderick's story was not to be believed, that hers were the lies of a cold-blooded killer.
She has embellished her story. She has tried to make it sound better because it wasn't quite good enough last time. She had to come up with something a little bit more to give her an excuse for shooting.
Defense attorney Jack Early used a metronome to hammer home the crux of his case, that Betty Broderick had slowly, methodically been driven to kill.
But it's like listening here. Sure, the first tick, the second tick. But if it goes on and on. If you're someone who's raised around music, they'll tell you the sound is enough to drive them crazy after you hear it over and over and over again.
For the second time in a year, Betty Broderick's fate was in the hands of a jury. This time, there would be a resolution.
The jury's verdict is next, in the conclusion of American Justice.
In late 1990, a deadlocked jury had failed to reach a verdict in the double murder trial of Betty Broderick. A year later, it looked like a second jury might end up the same way. Tensions were running high after 4 days of deliberations, with 11 jurors arguing for murder and 1 holding out for the lesser crime of manslaughter.
It became very clear to me that we were going to have to either be a hung jury or that we were going to have to compromise in some way.
To end the impasse, Foreman George McAllister had the jury revisit one of the prosecution's most powerful pieces of evidence, the shocking phone conversation between Betty Broderick and her then 11-year-old son, Danny.
You're just making it harder for all of us that wants to live over there. If you do something bad with everybody will be happier. At least I know I will.
With that emotionally charged atmosphere, I gave a speech about how it was important that we hang in there as far as coming up with a verdict and to, whatever we do, resolve it so that we could put an end to this case.
At McAllister's urging, they did, reaching a compromise verdict that would finally end the 2-year ordeal.
Everyone was extremely emotional. Several people were crying. Lots of people were holding hands and things, and everyone was very upset.
On December 10th, 1991, the verdict was announced to a packed courtroom.
We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Elizabeth Ann Broderick, guilty of the crime of murder and fix the degree thereof as murder in the second degree.
Members of Dan Broderick's family were outraged. They saw Betty as a cold-blooded killer who should have been convicted of first-degree murder. But second-degree murder meant that in the jury's view, she had pulled the trigger without premeditation. And it meant that even though she would receive the maximum sentence for her crime, 32 years to life in prison, she would be eligible for parole in the year 2011. In 1994, the California Supreme Court refused to hear Betty Broderick's final appeal. She is now an inmate at the California Institution for Women, about 50 miles from Los Angeles. She talked about life behind bars in a 1992 television interview.
I'm the same person that I was on the other side of that fence, and because of that, I try to live the life that I would like in here. And so I read and talk to people and do volunteer work and listen to music and do my job and obey the rules and eat dinner and just do what I do.
Betty still believes that she was driven to kill Dan and Linda Broderick. She has petitioned the governor of California for clemency.
She knows that there are 2 dead people here and that there is a need to have some type of punishment. And she's trying to look and say, have I not suffered enough?
I truly believe that she is very, very sick, and there's some element of perhaps even evil in her that makes her dangerous. I believe she should never be released from custody.
There is no deadline for the governor to rule on Betty Broderick's case, one that continues to resonate with the media and the public.
It's the trial that never dies. I think it still has some emotional effect on a lot of different people, particularly people who go through divorce, and they can see many of the same things happening.
But those who object to Betty's release see no mystery behind the murders of Dan and Linda Broderick. To them, the case has long been closed.
To the extent that we keep revisiting Betty and trying to find out what makes her tick and why did she do what she did, by doing that we imply that there's some justification that we can find if we just look far enough and long enough, and there isn't any justification for her action. Betty went out of control, and that's the end of the story.
Behind bars, Betty Broderick became something of a model prisoner. She worked as a clerk in a mental health unit and, according to prison officials, is well-liked by both correctional officers and inmates. Yet, Betty betrays no remorse for having killed Dan and Linda Broderick. She sees herself as a survivor, not a murderer, a wronged wife who exacted a kind of rough justice. Dan wanted me dead, she told us. I may be in prison, but I am alive. I'm Bill Curtis.